Well, welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name is John Hagan. I'm chair of the Maine Climate Table, your host for today. Welcome to the webinar with Alec Giffen on forest carbon offsets. I'll introduce Alec in a few minutes. For those of you who are familiar with the Maine Climate Council, we're not that. That's Governor Mills' legislative climate initiative in Maine. The Maine Climate Table is a network of individuals and businesses and nonprofits that was formed in 2013 to do several things. One, to help keep the climate conversation going in Maine during the previous administration. Two, to help people be well informed about climate change and climate science. And three, to engage people who aren't otherwise engaged on climate change. This is really an all hands on deck issue, and we need everyone participating in whatever way is right for them. So our webinar series is focused on the being well informed part of our mission. We've tried to step up the frequency of our webinars because we're all stuck at home for a while. Thanks to technology, we can at least all still learn together. So I'm definitely looking forward to the next hour of thinking about something other than coronavirus. So before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. Please keep your mic on mute. I can mute everybody from the command center here, but it would help me if you keep your mic on mute. And also please hold all your questions till the end of Alec's presentation, just so we can complete the story. Now, let's see, Alec asked me to queue up this topic so that he could focus on the new part of the idea. So I'm going to give a short, high-level intro on forest carbon offsets. I know not everyone on this call today is familiar with the conceptual challenges of offsets. Alec and I really worked hard on this issue together a decade and a half ago in the early 2000s. When he was head of the Maine Forest Service, and we were trying to figure out how to get forest offsets integrated into the new regional greenhouse gas initiative, the Northeastern States Regulatory Carbon Cap and Trade Program. At the time, we never really won the argument for forest offsets in the RGGI framework, but California's cap and trade program did accept forest offset projects as a legitimate means of meeting that state's emission goals, and several large landowners in Maine have sold their carbon into the California program. But it's not right for all forest landowners, and we'll talk a bit about that today. What we need are offset programs that are palatable to forest landowners, that keep the forest economy going or even growing, but that also legitimately reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that's a lot. It doesn't sound complicated, but that's a lot to pull off simultaneously. And if you don't know why, you'll learn why today. So give me just a second. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Give me a second. Okay, so trees. A lot of people are spending a lot of money trying to invent a machine that will take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it somehow. Well, nature figured this out about 350 million years ago during the Carboniferous period. Trees are the perfect instrument for taking carbon out of the atmosphere. The only energy input they need to operate is sunlight. So they're solar-powered carbon scrubbers. So we'd like more of these about right now. And we'd like to be able to make more things out of trees so we can make room to grow even more trees. We can think about forests as a conveyor belt for removing carbon from the atmosphere. So the big question is, can we as a society find ways to engage forest landowners to increase the speed of their carbon conveyor belts? the forest carbon offset market developed to do just this. The idea of offsets is if you're a power plant or a corporation or even an individual and you emit CO2 or other greenhouse gases, you can offset your emissions by investing in forest growth, speeding up some landowners' forest carbon conveyor belt. You'd think this would be pretty simple and obvious and easy, but unfortunately it's not quite. There are three conditions that need to be met for a forest carbon project to actually make a difference to the atmosphere. Remember, making a difference to the atmosphere is the goal here. These three issues are additionality, permanence, and leakage. And I'm going to explain each of these quickly. Additionality, if you're going to pay a forest landowner for their carbon to offset your emissions, the landowner has to do something different than they would have done anyway. Otherwise, the atmosphere won't really see any difference. Or at least in the California offset framework, the landowners have to do something different from the average landowner in the region. It's not perfect, but we can't always have perfect. Permanence. The idea is that the climate issue, the climate challenge is a century scale problem. So if a forest landowner can pull additional carbon out of the atmosphere, it needs to stay out of the atmosphere long enough until we find some other solution to the climate problem. And this has, by policy convention anyway, generally been set at 100 years. And then leakage is a seemingly impertinent term that gives a lot of people headaches, but let me frame it up this way. If you're a Maine landowner, say, and you extend the rotation length, the growth time of your trees to capture more carbon, to hold more carbon on the landscape, that means you're capturing more carbon. But if society still needs the same amount of wood products, somebody else, somewhere else, maybe New Hampshire or Vermont, has to step in and meet that demand for wood. So in the end, through leakage, the atmosphere really doesn't see any difference. And the atmosphere doesn't care about our state boundaries. So, so those are three challenging issues to meet in any forest carbon offset project. Alec's going to talk about these things today, these issues today. So really what Alec and the New England Forestry Foundation are trying to do is to come up with a framework that maintains or grows the forest economy while also meeting these three criteria. And I would say, it's a new idea in sort of in the spirit of we're all in this together today on this call. I'd like everyone to, think about how we can help Alec and Neff think this through. We're all looking for good ideas right now, and anybody can have a good idea that might improve the basic goal of using forests to help address climate change. So I'm going to turn it over, before I turn it over to Alec, I'm going to ask, see if Bob Purcell's on the line. I think he is. Bob's executive director of the New England Forestry Foundation, and I'd like him to say a few words about why you guys are working on this issue and have been for some time. So Bob, the floor is yours.
Just basic essential facts here that from our 75 years of managing forest lands in this region, we feel pretty comfortable with. Number one, good forestry can increase the yield per acre. Number two, higher stocking obviously stores more carbon in the forest, but it can also increase yields. And number three, wood products that offset other climate-intensive products like concrete, steel, plastic can really help mitigate the climate problem. So basically, when we put this together, we think our forests can hold more carbon, be more productive, produce more wood products, and make a major contribution to climate change. We feel it's such a major contribution that we're able, in a New York Times op-ed last fall, to make the claim that even with our beginning analysis, we haven't even put all the variables together, but we think there could be a 1.9 gigaton effect. What does that mean? That's equivalent to taking every vehicle in New England off the road for more than 20 years. That's significant. That's a big climate wedge. And so we're putting our attention to how do we implement something like that? So a couple of key things. Number one is this won't happen without financial incentives for the landowners who are managing their land. That's necessary and important, and just we aren't going anywhere until we address that issue. But we think those financial incentives can be turned on, and that's what we're beginning to work at. Think of the geographic and economic realities of New England. In the north, we've got vast forests, and that's where most of the climate potential resides. In the south, there's a need to offset emissions. The state of Massachusetts wanted to go carbon neutral or 80% carbon neutral by 2050. Now they've ratcheted that up. They want to go 100% carbon neutral by 2050. That's going to require offsetting. There's a need to offset and the financial ability to pay for those offsets in the south. So we've got a north and a south. What we need to do is connect the net suppliers in the north with the net buyers in the south. Now that sounds easy. We know it's not going to be that easy to do. But really what needs to happen is both the buyers and the sellers need to agree to the scientific principles and agree that it should be enacted, the practicality of making this kind of system work. Today, Alec is going to tell you about the good work that he and others at NEF and our partners have done to bring the scientific case forward. And we hope sometime after this, we can do more work on the practicality of setting this system up. So thanks for a couple of minutes to introduce this. John, I'm going to go on mute and turn it back to you and to Alec. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bob. That was great. Okay, Alec, are you still with us?
I am.
Say hello.
Yep.
All right, good. I'm going to, where is your, there you are. Hang on a second. I'm going to make you spotlight video. Okay, I'm going to talk, just introduce Alec here a minute. Alec, you were director of the Maine Forest Service from when to when? Seemed like about a decade in the early.
8 years.
Okay.
2003 to 2011.
Okay, that's sound. Thank you for that. And now he works with both the New England Forestry Foundation and the Clean Air Task Force on forestry and climate change issues. I had the good sense to get out of that topic 15 years ago. Alec stuck with it. So that's why he's speaking today, and I'm looking forward to hearing about it. So Alec, you have the floor. Jen's there to start the slide deck when you're ready, but if you'd like to just frame this up, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I see that my video is a little herky-jerky, so
you look okay.
We'll do what we can. So first of all, I want to start off by saying thanks to John and the Maine Climate Table for hosting this important event. John and I did indeed sit around my desk at the Maine Forest Service along with Dave Struble, who was my Maine Forest Service climate muse, he called himself, and tried to figure out, how do we do this? How do we make a difference in forestry by tapping the money that could potentially be available from the climate markets? And I have kept at it. It's been one of the most fascinating, difficult to understand topics that I've ever worked on in my life, but I really think that it is probably the biggest opportunity and challenge that we have as foresters in our lifetime. We have the chance to really make a difference, both for the atmosphere and for our forests. So that's the spirit in which we keep after this. I also want to thank the New England Forestry Foundation and the Clean Air Task Force for their support of this effort. Funding for this has been thin to non-existent at times in the past, but both of them have seen the importance of this and persevered. So I really owe them a huge debt of gratitude. I guess what I start off by saying is there are really big things afoot on this topic. Forests have and are continuing to gain recognition as more important to humanity than ever before. You're all familiar, I believe, with the Trillion Trees report that talks about forest planting. You may be less familiar with work by Chad Oliver down at Yale and others who calculated that if we simply used existing forest productivity, not increasing forest productivity, but increasing the use of our existing production, that we could reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 14 to 31%. Huge change. And when you combine that with things like the Trillion Tree report, you can end up with something that solves most of the problem. Interest in mass timber is growing dramatically. And that's not to speak of all of the secondary values from improving the management of our forests for wildlife and biodiversity, our own psychic well-being, and connecting with the natural world and recreation. Since the coronavirus hit, and I've always done a lot of hiking, but I have been blown away by the number of folks that I see on the trails that I'm using who are out there, obviously, to do one of the few things that's left that they can enjoy, which is connect with nature in the outside world. The parking lots are full and lots of people on the trail. So this could end up being a really good thing for people's awareness of the importance of forests and our parks. So I guess the question, this is kind of picking up on what John was talking about. A question that I would have for you is, what other proven technology is there out there for removing significant amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere efficiently? You know, there's been thought given to releasing particles into the atmosphere. There's been serious discussion about seeding parts of the ocean with iron to increase algae blooms. But all of those potential solutions have unforeseen consequences. We know how to manage forests. We know that they can function in the way that John talked about, as a conveyor belt or a pump to pump CO2 out of the atmosphere. If we grow them, harvest them, use the wood products, store the carbon in wood products, and avoid the emissions from other materials. Maine has a real opportunity to lead here. What we're going to talk about today is one idea for how we could make a significant difference and lead by both storing more carbon in the forest and maintaining or increasing harvest, which we need to do to provide that supply of materials to offset other materials. Concrete is responsible for about 8% of global carbon emissions. And it takes 10 times as much energy to produce a steel stud as it does a wooden stud. We have a miracle product here and a miracle biological system to work with. To succeed, we're going to need leaders on climate policy, the forestry community, the conservation community, and the forest products industry to all step up to the plate, come together, and work on this jointly. My own personal journey with this, I didn't realize it at the time, but started back when I was doing research for the University of California and the National Park Service, and we were looking at what was the reason why mountain meadows in the Sierra Nevada were disappearing. And one of the conundrums at the time was, why weren't we entering an ice age? We should have been in an ice age. If you look at all of the different factors, that the tilt of the earth, the orbit, et cetera, a variety of different things that influence the formation of ice on the planet, we were overdue for an ice age. Well, it wasn't until much later, in fact, there was a seminal book published by William Rudiman in 2013 entitled Earth Transformed, that he made the argument that humans, basically, without knowing it, have been managing the Earth's climate for thousands of years. It started with deforestation and then the production of rice, which produces a lot of methane. And in fact, he makes the case that if it weren't for humans managing the climate in this way, that civilization never would have occurred. Now, with the Industrial Revolution, things got a little out of hand, and we're now in a circumstance where we're not doing good things for our own survival. We're damaging those prospects. Then in the late 90s, Environment Northeast, which is now the Acadia Center, asked me to work with them on a roadmap for climate mitigation in Connecticut. And then John and others and I continued the work when I was at the Maine Forest Service. So this has been a really, really interesting journey. And I feel like we have a lot that we can do. So Jen, why don't you pull up the slide deck and we'll start through it. Okay, next slide, Jen. So a couple of caveats up front. This is not to indict anybody. We have a financial system that rewards landowners only for timber and where people are motivated to try and pay the least that they can for that timber. That's the system that we have. And that's part of going back to what Bob said. We understand the implications of that system, and that's what we're trying to change. We're trying to make this profitable for people to practice forestry that's climate friendly and does a better job of enhancing other forest values. I'd ask you to consider the possibilities of improving the value that our forests provide. I'd ask you to suspend disbelief. We are not necessarily trapped in the existing system. We can change it if we all work together. And then finally, this is a work in progress, and we welcome your thoughts as we go forward here. This is far from a complete job at this point. Jen, next slide. Next slide. Jen. Jen.
It's advanced on my end, Alec.
It's maybe a little delay. That's okay.
Okay, I'll just
keep talking.
Forward.
Jen will catch up.
Yeah. Okay. And John, I'm not seeing myself on the right-hand side of the screen. If you wanted that to be the case,
I'm still seeing you here.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Okay, I think.
All right. Good. So just quickly, take-home messages from John and Bob. There's a big opportunity here, which John and Bob have talked about. And beyond that, the existing mechanisms, which John touched on, we know that they have problems, particularly for small landowners. They require a scale, generally about 5,000 acres, as I understand it, for them to work because of the costs and the requirements of those systems. Costs are high. Timeframes typically are the 100 years that John has talked about. And because of the way that they deal with the issue of leakage, they do not necessarily produce the actual reductions in greenhouse gas levels that they should be. So we'll talk more about each of those in a minute. Next, Jen. So we've been, tell me if I'm getting ahead of myself, John, because it's not coming up on my screen.
Yep, I see it. I got it. Yep,
okay. So NEF has been working on how to understand, how to increase the value of northern forests for 6 years, as Bob mentioned. And what we've done is we've, among other things, we've developed a set of forestry standards for the Acadian forest, which deal with climate mitigation, improving wildlife habitat and biodiversity writ large, and growing and producing more and better timber. So specifically, I'm going to focus on that last one. This is not about just increasing stocking in the woods. It's about growing more timber, which is available for harvest so that it can be used to displace other materials. On the right-hand side of the screen are the essence of those standards. And I'll just point out a couple of things. We deal with umbrella wildlife species. So we've picked wildlife species that meet the needs of the vast majority of Maine vertebrate wildlife. And University of Maine research has shown that if you manage for the combination of the American marten and Canada lynx, you're going to meet the needs of 84% of Maine's vertebrate wildlife. We're also calling for a diverse forest stand size class distribution, which is recommended by ecologists. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then again, we're talking about growing and harvesting more timber. So we're trying to cover the full spectrum simply in a way that people can intuitively understand how this will result in improvements for wildlife, improvements for forest productivity, and improvements for our climate. So we took these, and these are the foundation of what we do. We took the exemplary forestry standards, we met with the region's foremost silviculturalists, and we compiled all of the forest inventory and analysis data from the U.S. Forest Service, NextGen, for 4.3 million acres in the state of Maine, northwestern Maine. We defined more than 40 different cases. We defined the silviculture that would be needed to deal with those cases. And essentially what we got from the silviculturalist was that we should be going with what's called irregular shelterwood and thinning together. And so on this slide, you see a picture. Upper left is a stand on Seven Islands land up near the Canadian border, where they have done a thinning, an early commercial thinning, to improve the growth prospects for that forest. On the right is an early commercial thinning here in southern Maine that was accomplished profitably with moderate-sized equipment. It was a processor that performed this thinning and crop tree release. And then the lower left is an example of irregular shelterwood from the Appalachian Mountain Club lands up in the 100-mile wilderness where they're practicing this kind of forestry. So what are the results for climate? Next, Jen. So if you practice this kind of forestry on a stand in average condition, remember that we collected all the FIA plots for 4.3 million acres, so we know exactly what the average forest condition is out there. And you practice this kind of forestry, what do you end up with for climate? Bottom line is you end up with an increase of 30 metric ton equivalents per acre of CO2 in a period of 25 years. And you can see it goes up and it even goes higher than that, but 30 tons is what you can sustain over the 60-year period that we modeled. And then it should go up even higher after that, because you're not at the end of the process of restocking these stands and improving quality at the end of 60 years. Bottom line, big increase in carbon storage. And that's where we came up with the number that Bob told you about, 1.9 gigatons. And that's equivalent to taking every car in New England off the road for 20 years. Huge impact. Who would have thought? Next slide. What are the results for habitat? The results for habitat are that we can deal with some issues. We did based on that FIA data, we did an analysis of the habitat needs of the region. To no surprise, turned out things like old trees are disappearing from the landscape, patch sizes are being reduced. Those patch sizes are very important to some species. For example, American marten need patches of about a square mile in relatively continuous forest cover. And that the stand size class distribution was not what was recommended by ecologists. Next, Jen. So this next slide shows the current stand size class distribution in blue and what the ecologists recommend in green. And these are U.S. Forest Service ecologists out of the Durham office, very highly regarded people. And you can see that we have more than we should in the regeneration class. We have more than we should have in the sapling and pole timber class. And we have less than we should have in the saw timber class. And then in the very large saw timber complex structure stands, we have very, very little. Next. So how does this relate to productivity? Well, based on information that Bob Seymour, silviculturalist at the University of Maine, has provided, if we increase the stocking on these lands, we will increase both the growth and hence the opportunity to harvest more wood. And he draws the relationship this way. So exemplary forestry for the Acadian forest has been sort of our testing ground, and we've done all of this modeling to be able to show what the results are. Next slide, Jen. We're now doing the same thing for southern New England. We're in the early stages of defining what those standards should be, and the circumstances in southern New England are quite different because what we need to do there is we have an overrepresentation of saw timber size stands 80 to 100 years old, and we have a dearth of habitat in early succession and mid-stage stands. So we have to work on trying to create a demand and getting landowners down there to practice forestry. Next slide. So what's our proposal? Our proposal is to create a Maine program that addresses the problems that exist with the other mechanisms and is attractive to small landowners. And we're targeting this to landowners who own up to 5,000 acres. There are two interrelated and overlapping sets of ideas, one from the Maine Forest Service, one from NEF. I'm going to talk about NEF. But there's a considerable amount of overlap between these. We did invite the Maine Forest Service to participate in this talk, but Patty Cormier, the director of that organization, had too many other commitments to be able to do it. Bottom line is that both of these efforts to identify how to move forward are important. Having a diversity of ideas and approaches is healthy. And if we did either one of them, it would be a major advance. So what does the NEF proposal include? Next. The central ideas in our proposal, and again, this is a work in progress. We're not contending that this is perfect or that it's final, but that it's our best thinking up to this point. The central ideas are to reward landowners for increasing in-forest carbon stocking while maintaining harvest. We're persuaded that the key time frame is the 30 years, the next 30 years, because if we don't address the climate change problem within that time frame, the scientists tell us that things will get very difficult, and we will have worse consequences than we would if we get on top of it now. And we've designed it to be attractive to landowners. So that means you have to make some adjustments to the three things that John talked about in terms of additionality, leakage, and permanence. And we'll talk more about that. And we also recognize that multiple approaches are possible and indeed desirable, because by using multiple approaches, you can attract more people to participate than you would with one size fits all. Next slide, Jen. So before I get into the approaches themselves, I need to talk with you about what are called stocking guides. And the stocking guides basically tell you, if you have a certain diameter stand, how many trees per acre you need in order for that stand to be fully stocked. And there are three principal lines on a stocking guide. There is the A line, and the forestry wisdom is that if you go above the A line, that growth rates decline. So that's the point at which you should be harvesting. And then the B line is when the site is fully occupied, but the trees are free to grow. And they should be able to regrow to the A line within 10 years. The C line means that the site is not fully occupied. So building on that understanding then of stocking levels, what are we proposing? Jen, next slide. And Jen, could you tell me when it comes up? If it's not coming up instantaneously for folks, that would be good to know. But this is a diagram of how this system that we're proposing would work. So starting on the left-hand side of the graphic, it deals with stands that are below the B line. And what would happen is that the landowner receives a payment for agreement not to reduce the stocking levels below their initial level in 30 years. And then there's a fork, and they either receive a payment for increasing stocking, and they commit to a level of stocking and they receive a payment for it, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Or the other branch is that they receive a payment for implementing practices which are known to reduce greenhouse gas levels over 30 years. So there'd be science behind it. It's just not paying people for something that perhaps is good for another reason. These payments need to be based on the greenhouse gas reductions. Now, under the practice option, the payments that somebody receives are probably going to turn out to be less than they would be on the left-hand side, because the system is less rigorous. It relies on average greenhouse gas reductions rather than things where a person is committing to a certain level of stocking, and hence we know how much additional carbon is being captured. Under the payment for increasing stocking, there are two options. One is to receive payments in 10, 20, and 30 years based upon measured increases in stocking levels. And the other is to receive an upfront payment for an agreement to increase stocking within 30 years. And there are some nuances that we can talk about, having a sliding scale that depends, so that the payments depend upon how much harvesting you're going to do. And these all require that you have to maintain harvest while you're increasing stocking, which may sound like it's impossible, but I'll get to that in a minute, because it's not. So there are nuances about how much wood are you going to harvest, and if you're harvesting something like the statewide average, then you get 100% of the payment. If you only cut half of it, then you receive 50%. All of the details to be worked out. Now, over on the right-hand side of the diagram, so moving from the B line over to the one that deals with the A line, which is over on the right, for folks whose stands are at the A line or above, the proposal is to pay them if they're willing to initiate active management and not go below the B line. So essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to set up a system of incentives here where people receive incentives to get their stocking up to the B line, and then basically to get it to operate then after that between the A line and the B line, which will actually probably increase productivity over what we have now. So it's a system that very much embraces the idea that we need to increase carbon stocking in the forest, but we also need to increase productivity and maintain the flow of wood products, not only for climate purposes, but also to maintain the health of rural economies. So why is it important to harvest? Jen, next slide.
And Alec, I'll just interject with a quick technical note, which is that on my end, the slides always advance instantaneously. So I'll have to rely on John to give me a holler if it gets really delayed.
That's good. There's a delay for me too, Alec, so it's up now. I'll let you know when I see it. Yep. It may be different for different people.
Right. Okay, so why is it important to maintain harvest? The reason is that it avoids the leakage problem, which is inherent in a number of these other approaches, and it provides wood to substitute for other materials. This is a simplified graphic from a massive study that was done in the United Kingdom by a group of authors headed by Matthews. And basically what it shows, the blue line at the top is no effect on greenhouse gas levels. Okay, so that's 0. So if you were doing bad things, you'd be above that. If you're doing good things, you're below it. And what this shows is that if you just let the stand grow, which a lot of people are advocating for, you end up with the result that's on the dotted red line. And if you harvest the wood and you produce particularly long-lived wood products, which are toward the bottom of that green bar, you significantly reduce atmospheric greenhouse gas levels. And this study, one of the things that is important about it, two things that are important about it. One is that it compares using wood with the most reasonable alternative, as they determined in the UK, the materials that were being used in wood's stead. The other thing is it was done for a period of 20 years. So it's not looking out at 100 years from now. It's looking at what can we do within this 20 to 30 year time frame that we've talked about as being important. Okay, but is it possible, Jen, next slide?
Yep.
To both increase carbon storage and maintain harvest. And here are 5 real world examples of where we know that people have done this. And I'll focus on the one at the bottom. This is a piece of land that was owned by Ron Locke up in Quebec for a long period of time. And you'll see on the upper bar, which is in light blue gray, that was the initial stocking. And then the next bar down shows the stocking after 30 years. So the stocking went up by 5 cords per acre. And then it shows you how much wood was harvested on the property over that 30 years, which was 20 cords per acre. All of these are on a per acre basis. So 2/3 of a cord per acre per year on average, and stocking went up by 5 cords. So it is possible to do this. This is not business as usual forestry. Again, we have to provide the incentives. We need to make this pay if we want people to do it. So there's a reward for the landowners for practicing the kind of forestry which is going to benefit climate, benefit the full suite of forest values. Next, Jen. So this is going to require improving markets as well as providing financial incentives. And there's a couple of examples here. The one on the left is one of the things that we're going to have to do, which is we're going to have to intensify forest management, probably on the lands which are most productive. And this is J.D. Irving, which on about 10% of their land, last I knew, in Maine, they were planting genetically superior trees and growing them to sawlog size in 35 years, and putting them through their sawmill. On the right, you see a early commercial thinning that took place on the Seven Islands up near St. Pompfield on the Canadian border. This was done with a very small machine. There was a market that existed at the time for very small wood, and it shows you the kind of careful work that can be done that really leaves the stand in a good position to grow much more rapidly as a result of the thinning. Next. So how could this help? First of all, it could provide something that small landowners could participate in. The scale is such that they could participate in it. It doesn't require you to own 5,000 acres and be doing all of this monitoring of exactly how much carbon is there, you know, on a periodic basis. It's much more straightforward than that. Related to that, the cost should be relatively low to administer. And so that makes things a lot simpler. Third thing is we're talking about 30 years rather than 100 years. I recognize that, you know, you're going to have to do something after 30 years if you've increased the carbon stores and you want people to maintain those carbon stocks. But we know that if we don't do something within 30 years, if we don't develop a program that people can participate in easily, that we're really disadvantaging ourselves. So we've focused on the 30 years and saying, we know that there's an issue beyond that. And then the final thing is that unlike some other programs which use leakage rates of 20% or 40%, which are common, that this addresses the issue of leakage by requiring harvest. So it should actually reduce greenhouse gas levels effectively, which is part of why sort of disbelief in that has been part of the problem with getting people to embrace the idea of offsets generally and forestry offsets specifically. Next. So where does this all stand? Where it stands is that this has been submitted to the Natural and Working Lands subgroup on forestry. That's part of the Maine Climate Council enterprise. And the Maine Forest Service has submitted a related proposal with overlapping ideas. And all of that is going to be discussed by the forestry subgroup, then by the Natural and Working Lands group, and there are going to be public meetings where these ideas will be aired, and then there will be recommendations made to the Maine Climate Council later this spring, and then they will consider what to recommend to the governor by December of this year. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has about any of this.
Okay, this is John again. Everybody, if you weren't on when I started, there is, if you click on participants icon at the bottom center of your screen, a panel will come up on the right. And at the bottom of that panel on the right, you can click on a raise hand icon. If you will do that now, I will queue you up for questions. So does anybody have a question for Alec? And I'm not seeing the raise hand. Oh, there's a raise hand. Okay. Ha! No big surprise. Our friend Cy Balch. See you first, Cy. So you can unmute yourself and ask Alec a question, please.
Hi, Alec.
Hi, Cy.
In the first place, congratulations. This is a very good effort. There are a number of things about it that please me. It is important to focus that when you talk about increased growth, that you specify it's on sawlogs. Because total biomass probably doesn't increase, but sawlogs do. That's an important distinction for people. Secondarily, as you know, NEF went through the business of trying to sell carbon in New Hampshire, well, to the California market. And the real killer of that California program was the monitoring costs, the administration. So can you talk a little bit about how you see the administration costs of this, the checking, the third party, all of that that's a requirement in the California thing? How's that going to work in this?
Okay, sure. So let's talk about each of the options. So under the practice option, it would work like the NRCS programs do currently as I see it. So a landowner would sign up and they would say, I'm going to do practice X, and then they would do it, and then that would be verified and they'd be paid. In terms of the payment for increased stocking option, under the 10, 20, and 30 year approach, you'd have to have an inventory done, and that would then have to be verified as to the stocking levels going up. And in the case of the payment upfront option, you'd have to verify that the stocking levels had gone up to the level that the landowner signed up for at the end of 30 years. But all of that is a lot more straightforward than what's currently required under, say, the compliance markets as currently constructed. So I'm imagining that this could be done far more simply and straightforwardly than is currently the case, and that's part of the appeal and part of the reason why we think it could work for small landowners.
Good, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Si. Ethel, unmute, ask away.
This is Doug Denico.
Oh, hang on, Doug. You didn't raise your hand. But that's okay. Go ahead. Go ahead,
I am
Doug.
not on your. I am not on your Skype stuff.
Oh,
I just got a
okay.
telephone. I'm trying to be socially distanced from you guys, so there's nobody on the screen.
Well, thank you for that. Okay, hang on, Ethel. Doug's going to go next. Doug, please.
Yeah, my question is this: I've been wrestling with some of these things on my own ownership, and right now I've got probably over 200 acres that's over the A line that it's popple and crappy hardwoods, and they really need to be ground zeroed. And what I'm not hearing from Alec is, what about those situations where you do ground zero and you bring it back through plantations and whatnot like that? Because that's the only way I see to go. But the trouble is, starting about 3 years ago, the mills dropped their prices at the point that I can no longer afford that kind of silviculture. And yet I think it's an important way to go with those stands. Just wipe them out. There's no value there. There isn't going to be. It's going to be beech and popple again. But we need another method that has to be a little bit aggressive, rather than what I hear between the A, B, C lines that's been said. So I guess my question is are you going to consider some more aggressive techniques and subsidizing planting and PCT?
Yeah. Good point, Doug. I hadn't incorporated that in here. I'll have to think about it. Yes, I agree that there are stands out there, particularly things like disease beech, where from the point of view of habitat productivity, increasing carbon stocks over time, et cetera, it may be that the best thing to do is to start over. We haven't incorporated that into this at this point. Thank you for the comment.
Yep, thank you, Doug. Ethel, you're on.
Hi, I was wondering if you could go over where the payments, the rewards for the landowners how they would be generated?
Ethel, I can't quite hear you. Can you get a little closer to the mic? Say that.
How will the payments be generated to the landowners?
Okay. How will the payments be generated?
Yeah. Okay, well, there may be people who are in corporations that are interested in having the carbon rights, and these are going to be contracts with the landowners. So this will be legally binding. So there may be people who are interested in buying those. I mean, we've all heard that, for example, the airlines have set a target for, being carbon neutral. And then there are other folks that have already gone down that road to some extent already. So eventually, one hope is that these may be of sufficient value that there actually would be, outside folks who want to mitigate their climate impact who are willing to pay for them. It may be that in terms of starting out, it might be that the state of Maine would have to front the funding, and I know that that's challenging, but perhaps on a pilot basis to prove that this works, and then to test out the idea of, okay, so do we then have something which is merchantable after we front the money for it, so that it becomes something which is essentially no cost or maybe even profitable to the state to do. But let me ask Bob Purcell if he would weigh in, because I know he's been thinking about this in relationship to southern New England.
Okay, if Bob's still on, before Bob jumps in, let me just say it's, according to my clock, 12:59. It'll be 1 o'clock in a minute. If you got to go, go. But I'm going to keep the conversation going here. So if you don't have to go and like to stay on, please do. I've got some questions for Alec too. So if you got to go, go. And otherwise, Bob, are you still with us? Unmute.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Great.
Alec, I touched on this in my introductory remarks. I mean, part of this is, it has to start in the state of Maine, and people have to agree it's a good idea, you get it going. But I think the ultimate objective is to tap the financial markets in other states that need to offset their carbon emissions. Massachusetts, Connecticut, there's a lot of emissions down here. There's a lot of people, and there's the money. So if we can set a system up and they agree that this is a climate benefit, then we should expect to see them paying for this. And that's part of what we're trying to do, is kick the tires on the science on this. Can we prove to the people that would buy this that there are actual climate advantages in this? And there's ways of measuring it. And I think, with LIDAR now, there's ways of doing this through satellite information where we can be pretty accurate that if a landowner says they're going to increase their carbon, that they're actually doing it. And we can measure that on a weekly basis almost.
Mm-hmm. So to be clear, Alec, this is a carbon offset market instrument, just new. It's just new.
Yeah, well, we've hesitated to put it exactly that way, but we recognize that we have to figure out how we raise the money to do this, and that's one obvious way of looking at it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, landowners get paid something somehow. It sounds like
they have to. Yeah. I mean, if we want different practices implemented, we have to figure out how to make it pay.
Yep.
It's as simple as that.
Yep.
I mean, I have on my own land, I have stuff that I would love to do, and like Doug is saying, I can't make it pay currently. So then it just becomes, sort of a hobby kind of thing, and you can't do that on the millions of acres that we need to have action on. So we need to figure out how to make this pay.
Well, again, it's just it's a mechanism to pay for good silviculture, whatever pathway that might take.
Right.
Something that you can't do right now because you're constrained by price or money. Okay. Other raise hand if you got a question. Okay, somebody call Will. Will, you're on. Unmute and.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
It's Will Merck. Hi, Alec. How you doing?
Good. Glad you could participate, Will.
Sure. Wouldn't miss it. Alec, have you tried to quantify the total amount of carbon or greenhouse gas equivalents that this program would result in sequestering and the cost thereof?
We haven't done that modeling for the small landowners, Will. We've done it for northern New England sort of generally, and that's where we came up with this 1.9 gigatons and taking the cars off the road for 20 years. We have not specifically modeled this as yet. Frankly, you know, the last round of changes in this came out of a meeting that we had a couple of weeks ago with the folks in the forestry committee of the Natural and Working Lands group. So answer to your question is we haven't done it yet, but something we should do.
Good. Other questions?
Yeah, this is Cy back again. I got a notice from FRA the other day about a plan that Reggie has to try to reduce carbon, and a discussion about raising fuel prices. And I'm curious if you are aware of that, trying to raise money for states to put back into controlling it. Basically having programs to reduce greenhouse gases. I think it's across 12 states in the Northeast. And several states have, it's not finalized by any means, and states are showing varying levels of enthusiasm. Maine is on the fence for sure. Are you aware of that?
Not aware of it, but we'll become aware of it. Is there anybody else on the line who is following that? Maybe Jeff Marks has been following that. Jeff, I saw you were on here. Are you still on, and have you been following that program?
Yeah, I'm not seeing his name on the queue right now.
I saw it earlier, but
might have gone off. Okay, got a question through the chat group here, but it's long. I'm trying to read and run the panel at the same time. Other questions? I'll try to read this. Lloyd, you got a hand up? Unmute.
Okay, I'm just unmuted.
Yep, gotcha.
There are a lot of questions. It is a fascinating start that moves the ball down range very nicely. And one thing that I have argued with myself about, and I don't know the answer, but I do think something that deserves some more thinking is the trouble with economists is they think about incentives all the time. And the difficulty that I have with many of these carbon market projects is that they pay up front and then there's no revenue anymore. And it would be desirable if we had a scheme where a property owner is getting revenue from the timber on a regular basis, as well as from their carbon on a regular basis. Because if you pay them for their carbon up front, there's no incentive anymore, no financial incentive. So one way to look at this is that there's a trade-off between intensity and cost of administration, which is what you see in the CARB things. Like you were saying, it costs a lot of money. Well, that's because there's no more incentive for the landowner to follow their plan because there's no money in it for them. If they got an annual payment for the carbon that's accrued, then you would have an incentive still. So again, I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I think it needs to be dealt with in any kind of program like this. Have you guys thought about that sort of contradiction?
Well, okay, so I think that may be part of the thinking behind the option of payment in 10, 20, and 30 years, Lloyd, is that you would be building an incentive in for the landowner to be making incremental progress. You know, one of the thoughts that has occurred to me as I considered this is, for example, on my own land, what I need to do is, on part of it, is go in and I need to reduce the carbon stocking right now. And if I could afford to, you know, if I could make it pay, I'd go in and I'd reduce the carbon stocking in the long-term benefit of that stand and its long-term carbon stocking. So I think it's important not to think about this as a steady increase. It's not a linear relationship. You can have a circumstance where you have to go down, as Doug was saying, before you can go up to get to where you need to go. So anyway.
I think you're right about that. You do have to have a way to go down. And the thing that seems to be invisible in a lot of the discussions on this is holding more growing stock in your stands that are going to move up. It can only be done by harvesting less in those stands. So the idea of touching the minimums in that profile over time makes a lot of sense.
Okay, Ethel, do you have another? Your hand is up again. Do you have another question? Or is that left over?
I think it's left over.
Okay. Let me ask the question that was submitted through the chat. I think I got it now. Is what's included in the stock? Is it only the C in the wood that is carbon in the wood that's marketable, or does it include soil carbon in some way? It seems like only the marketable wood is a part of this model, which I think is true. But Alec?
Well, it might not have to be only the marketable wood. But I hadn't been thinking about the soil side, because my understanding is that the analyses of all the studies that have been done in our part of the world is that, and I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but that won't stop me though. That doesn't change much, over these kind of time scales. And for anybody who's interested in that idea, I would encourage you to look at the work that's been done by the Cooperative Forestry Research Unit up at Weymouth Point in Maine, which is up near Chesuncook Lake, where they did very extensive harvesting, and then they looked at nutrient levels, carbon levels, productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd encourage you to look at that. However, it could be that it's not just what's in the merchantable wood, it could be what's in the biomass, perhaps. And that's not a level of detail that I've thought down through at this point. But it seems to me, since we know we can, with formulas, say, okay, so if we have this much merchantable wood and it's of this species, then we can expect there's so much carbon in the, in the limbs and tops, et cetera, that it's not inconceivable that we could take into account carbon in the total biomass stock, but I hadn't been thinking about the soil.
Well, since we have the carbon soil god on the line here, Ivan, if you want to weigh in on that, if you can think of any way that a landowner might be compensated for their soil carbon, this would be a great opportunity to include it.
So I certainly am not the soil carbon god, or whatever you would like to call me. And I think that's a good point. The research is not sort of settled on what the impacts are. Alec, you're right. I mean, there's meta-analyses out there that show it can be reduced and it can increase. The amount of carbon in the soil is big, so a small change could be important, but we have very poor data on monitoring of forest soil carbon. It's variable. There is no ongoing monitoring of those stocks, and the bulk of it does change slowly. So a first approximation of a program that says that we're going to assume that that's static makes sense to a point. However, the more disturbance to the site, the more carbon you'll lose from the soil in the short term. And if we're talking about the next 30 years, then some thought should be given to the impacts.
Yep, that's great. It's a great addition.
We'll look forward to you chipping in on this.
Yeah, thanks, Alec.
All right, Tom Walker, I got your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Alec.
Hey, Tom.
I'm curious whether you've been able to do enough analysis yet to see whether when you combine your reduced transaction costs with, the sort of basic economics of the change in management, whether the carbon price that, you kind of see in California markets now is enough to compensate people for the change in management costs on a typical, a typical average, acreage that somebody might own.
Have not done that yet. Again, remember, we just put we put the finishing touches on this a couple of weeks ago. So no, and we would welcome your assistance with doing just that analysis, Tom. Tom is a resource economist of renown.
And don't mention the word biomass. Well, Alec, let me jump in and just ask this question: if you're in the tree growth tax law program now in Maine, it means you've got a forester on retainer or something who could help you work through this model, right?
Yes.
You're already paying for a forester to do something on a periodic basis. So seems like you could layer the cost into paying your forester to help you align with this model at not too much of a cost, maybe.
That's the hope, is that we can do this in a way which both we can show clearly makes a difference in greenhouse gas levels and is not so onerous that it falls of its own weight. Mm-hmm. And to Tom's point, back again to where we started, this needs to be profitable. This needs to make business sense if we expect to have it done.
Yep. Sandy Buck, I thought I saw your hand up, but if maybe we asked the question or something. But anyway, any other questions for Alec?
Hey, John, it's Sandy here.
Hey, Sandy.
I think Ethel asked the money question.
Okay.
Which is the one that always makes me scratch my head. And Alec, I like your idea about, what is it, JetBlue that's looking to purchase offsets. Colleges are doing it. I know, Colby College went carbon neutral after COA did, and there's good movement across the board for that. So I think there are markets out there. And I also like the idea of having the state of Maine model the opportunity for sort of building our own Maine carbon market here. And I think that's something that, as you and I have talked about before, this is something that philanthropy might be able to help out with. I know there's interest. Coordinating that interest is always a little bit of a challenge, and raising the right amount of money to do it. I'm going to throw Will Merck under the bus here, because he's working on a payment plan also that might make some sense, that relies on markets, shorter periods of tying up the land, the 30 to 40 year one. So I don't know whether Will's still on or whether he wants to mention that, but in any event, it might make some sense for you and Will to talk afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Will was still there. Where'd he go?
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm still here.
Yeah,
that is an idea I've had, and I intend to socialize it a bit, and I'll send a copy along to Alec. It's aimed at the industrial landowners, however, so it's trying to take advantage of the scale economies up there.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
All right. Any other?
I've got one last bit of news, or perhaps advice. In all of this thing, this business of dealing with small landowners is tough because there are so many of them. There is a forester named Scott Schaus that I believe lives in Kentucky. He put together a program under the Chicago Climate Exchange and was making it work. So if you want somebody that's done it, I can put you in touch with Scott.
Oh, thank you.
Except the Carbon Climate Exchange went away, right?
That's correct, except that he created the system to monitor or to look after many small landowners.
Under that framework, which was an offset framework.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Got it.
Right.
That would be good to dig up. Okay, well, it's 1:17. We should probably stop now and let people go. I guess two more points before before I thank Alec for this, which was fantastic, I will say that speaking of Cy Balch, Cy told me about a new piece of legislation in Washington State where they're trying to figure this exact same thing out. I've been talking to the folks in Washington about what they're doing. They've got all the same questions and challenges that we've got here, and they're trying to work through them just like all of you are. So I'm gonna see if they might like to do a webinar at some point down the road to let us know what they're doing. And I'm keeping in touch with them now. Since we're all locked down to coronavirus, it's a good time to meet new people across the country. So I'll keep up with them and let you all know if there's anything interesting going on there. And then back to Alec and New England Forestry Foundation and Jen, who's running the slide deck. Thank you all. This was just a lot of fun. And I didn't think about coronavirus once for the last hour and 20 minutes. So thank you all for doing that. Thank you all for being on the line. And like I said, we're stepping up these webinars. Alec gave me the idea of doing one on nuclear energy. That should be really interesting. So I'll see what I can do. Okay, so thank you all. See you soon. Be careful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alec. Bye.